Hello, welcome back to Unit 3. Unit 3 is about vision. Now, so far, what we have discussed is specific to physiological and processes that happen in all sensory modalities, meaning vision, hearing, touch, all these modalities. Meaning that, remember, we talked about how we can divide the perceptual processes into 7 steps, where you have external stimulus, which is, for example, if you look at this picture over here, there is light. So there is light here, there is external object here, right? The light that is reflected from this, right, the is called the distal stimulus, right? You can either say the object or the light itself that is reflected is the distal stimulus. Now, this light that is reflected from this object, an image of is formed. Remember, the representation of the light that is reflected from this object is captured by your sense organs, specifically in your photoreceptors, right? So that image of the tree that is formed in your eyes, that is the proximal stimulus. Now, you can think of it why it's called proximal or distal stimulus. The idea is that when you are trying to look at this tree, right, your eyes are focused on the tree. So an image of the tree is formed on the retina. But what is actually looking at the tree is your brain. Your brain, the inner eye, is actually looking at an image of the tree that is formed on the retina. So there is this conundrum, there is this irony, there is this mysterious thing where we feel like we are experiencing the external world, but perhaps you're not, right? So when you look at this tree, are you really looking at this tree? Or let's look at this example. This coffee mug, are you looking at this coffee mug? An image of this coffee mug is formed on your retina, and your brain is actually perceiving that image that's formed on the retina. In this sense, your experience is that of the image of this one. That's why this image that is formed on the retina in the photoreceptors, that's the proximal stimulus. This is the distal stimulus, the tree itself. Then this information that is formed is because of the receptor changes, right? Those receptor processes would be in the photoreceptors would be, that's what we will talk about in photoreceptors. Then once the information is captured, right, in the photoreceptors, it goes from one layer of retina photoreceptor to another layer that we've discussed, right, in the structure of the eye, and eventually it goes to the brain. And all the changes this particular electrical signal that's formed within photoreceptors, it goes through all these changes together constitute the neural processing. And even within the brain, the information gets passed from one point to another, and we'll talk about what those points are. These processes are referred to as neural processing. And once it reaches a point where information from multiple places comes together, that's when you will experience something without knowing what it is. And there is subtle distinction between two processes. One is called perception, which is your psychological experience of experiencing something, and then recognition, which is identifying what you're experiencing at a global level. Okay, and we'll talk about the specifics of that later. And the next one is action, where you take a decision to do or not to do, what to do with it. So that is action. So for what we've discussed is these are the different steps: the distal stimulus, the proximal stimulus. The reason for the proximal stimulus is the receptor processes, and these receptor processes continue even when the information goes through different parts of the brain, and that's the neural processing. And once it goes through different processes and results in your conscious experience of the external object, that's perception. That's where we talked about the mind body problem. And as a result of perception, you recognize the object as a whole, not individual units, but as a whole. And once you recognize it, then you make a decision about what to do with it. Right? That is action. These are the 7 steps of perception. We'll talk about these 7 steps of vision in particular. And particularly, we'll talk about the initial steps, the eye, the retina, what happens in photoreceptors. So we'll talk about what is light, then we'll talk about the structure of the eye, then we'll talk about what happens within the within the photoreceptors, which results in creation of the electrical signals, and what happens to these electrical signals once they leave the photoreceptors and goes to other layers of the retina and goes out of the eye to different parts of the brain. So light is an electromagnetic radiation. It has both electrical and magnetic properties, and has both particle nature and wave nature to it. And now there is a big think about quantum mechanics and whether it's a particle or a wave, can it be both? And at the same time, so we're not getting into that yet. From what we understand, that the light nature or the wave nature of the light is what is more important for our vision than particulate nature, the photon nature. So when the light of different wavelength and light waves, electromagnetic radiations can be distinguished into different kinds based on the frequency or the wavelength. And there is only a specific part of light that is visible to us, and it's called visible, meaning that there are other electromagnetic radiations in the environment that you and I wouldn't be able to detect. The reason is the photoreceptors that we have are only sensitive to the wavelengths and frequencies specific to 400 to 700 nanometers wavelength, which falls within the visible light spectrum. Whatever other electromagnetic radiations that exist in the world, we cannot experience. Now, this again brings us to the question of, are we experiencing the external world as is? Definitely not, right? I mean, meaning that just to compare ourselves with other animals, for instance, like dogs, for instance, can hear some sounds that we cannot, right? So our experience of the external world is through the ability of our photoreceptors. And not just this vision, it can be sound or anything. Our experience of the external world are limited by the only means of experiencing the external world, and those are our sensory receptors. We cannot experience any electromagnetic radiations that fall beyond the normal range that we can experience. That doesn't mean that there is no world beyond the 400 nanometers wavelength of light is, but we are in what do you say? We are not equipped with the ability to experience the vision beyond those because of our limitations. Similarly, with sound, touch, everything else. The proximal stimulus, as we discussed, is the generation of the electrical signals in the photoreceptors. Once the information is captured or presented, right, and that information goes from the photoreceptors to the next layer of the retinal cells called the bipolar cells. From the bipolar cells, it goes to the ganglionic cells, and from the ganglionic cells, all the axons of the ganglionic cells come out as of the eye as optic nerve, and it goes to different parts of the brain. And in another video, you'll see how photoreceptors are distributed within the retina. We'll talk about the optic disc, and we'll talk about focusing in eye, the refractive errors, then the receptor process itself, which is like what within the photoreceptor results in the generation of electrical signals. We know that when light falls on the retina, right, if the structure is correctly focused, light falls on the retina, then that light physically passes through the first initial layers, right? Physically, it passes through these layers and reaches the photoreceptor layer. Once it reaches the photoreceptor layer, if the strength of the light that hits the photoreceptors and particular structure of the photoreceptors, right, that results in a cascade of events within the photoreceptor. And we'll talk about those changes. Specifically, there will be visual pigment molecules in the photoreceptors, right? And these visual pigment molecules, once they get activated, right, then they change their structure. Once it changes its structure, it what do you say? Um, it's kind of like one molecule getting activated. It activates few more molecules, and they're really like a chain of reactions of all molecules getting activated. If enough molecules in a given photoreceptor get activated, that photoreceptor would fire, meaning that that photoreceptor would generate the electrical signal. Now, remember when we talked about electrical signals, we talked about electrical signals or sudden change in electrical, what do you say, electrical. You'll need to unlock your iPhone first. I'm sorry about that. Electrical signals. Sorry about that. So remember how we talked about when what is electrical signal generation or action potential generation? It is a sudden reversal of the charge on the axon, where the negative is outside is negative, then inside, and suddenly it changes from negative 70 to positive 35 millivolts. Remember that? That reversal happens because in this photoreceptor, there are enough VP molecules that fired, which resulted in this particular photoreceptor right here, let's say rod, for instance, to fire. That which is fired, right, this electrical signal, it goes, and because this is a very small photoreceptor, it doesn't have like a long axon, it goes from the photoreceptor to, it gets attached to the next layer of neuron, which is the bipolar cell. It goes from one to other, remember, in the form of chemical signals. And from here, it goes to bipolar cell. The bipolar cell will also fire, and this firing will go to the next cell, but the axons are not too long here. It's the next layer of cells is the ganglionic cell layer. The ganglionic cell layer are the ones that have the long neurons, and all the ganglionic cells in one eye, right? Their axons, they come together and come out of the eye as the optic nerve. Remember, we talked about how optic nerve is formed here, right? And this optic nerve will go to the brain. So receptor process is about what are the chemical changes, reactions that happen in the photoreceptor that results in generation of the action potential within the photoreceptor, right? That photoreceptor that has fired as a result of the light that entered the photoreceptor. In other words, if light that is reflected from an object, it activates a photoreceptor strong enough, it will fire. That firing is transmitted all along to the brain. And that's how the information is transmitted. That's what the chemical thing is. Now, this is another interesting thing about the role of photoreceptors in dark adaptation. Now, dark adaptation is basically how your photoreceptors change their receptivity or sensitivity once you enter a dark room, right? Have you ever noticed when you enter like a theater, for instance, right? When the movie has already started or yet to start, the screen is very dark, and you entered the theater, and for a moment you don't see anything, right? But slowly your visual system gets adapted, so you start seeing things, right? In other words, your photoreceptors are adapting to function in the darkness. So that's why it's called dark adaptation. Initially, everything is dark, but your photoreceptors get sensitive enough, right? And first cones, then rods. We'll talk about the story of that. Eventually, what happens is you will start seeing things slowly. Especially, you'll be able to see things that are more blue-like, and there's a reason for that. We'll talk about that in the dark adaptation. And we talk about some beautiful experiments related to dark adaptation in the things. So we'll also, and this is one of the research activities that I want you to go through, is Purkinje effect. Purkinje effect is also related to dark adaptation. Now, if you ever been to, what do you say, at the park or um, on a walk in the evenings, and especially when it's about to, the sun is about to set, and when you see that, suddenly it becomes from light to dark, and what happens then is that there comes a point where you will see everything bluish. Your sensitivity gets increased towards blue light at that particular point of time. That increased sensitivity to bluer side of the spectrum during sunset, that's called Purkinje effect. And we'll talk more about this within the activity itself. I'll stop here. It's been a very long video. Stay tuned.